sophomores, this is Ma'am March, and this is another week of series of video discussions for Gen 006 Ethics. And for this week, we will focus on Module 16 entitled Moral Theories and Mental Frameworks, the Utilitarianism by Mill and Bentham, and also Module 17 entitled Ethical Challenges for Business, Globalization, and Business Ethics. So let's focus first on Module 16. Okay, and here are your lesson objectives. So at the end of the lesson, okay, so you guys should be able to analyze and compare Mill and Bentham's theory of utilitarianism, and you should also be able to evaluate the tenets of utilitarianism. All right, so I'm sure you have heard about utilitarianism, okay, from your previous discussions, okay, most especially if you have been studying economics, okay, maybe you have heard about the word utilitarianism before, okay. So when we talk about utilitarianism, okay, this is a theory of morality, all right, that advocates actions that foster happiness or pleasure, okay, and oppose actions that cause unhappiness or harm. Okay, so again, when we talk about utilitarianism, okay, we focus on actions that bring about happiness, because according to this theory, okay, the goal of this theory, okay, is for individuals, is for the whole individual, okay, or in the whole society must achieve happiness, okay. So you would have to foster happiness or pleasure and oppose actions that cause unhappiness or harm, okay. So when directed towards, making social or economic or political decisions, a utilitarian philosophy would aim for the betterment of the society as a whole. Okay, so utilitarianism would say that an action is right if it results in the happiness of the greatest number of people in a society or a group. Okay, so when we talk about utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, you always hear that. Okay, so that's what this theory talks about. Okay, so now there are two philosophers, okay, who are advocates of utilitarianism. We have Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So let's start first with Jeremy Bentham. Okay, so Jeremy Bentham describes his greatest happiness principle. Remember that these two philosophers, okay, focus on utilitarianism, and when we talk about utilitarianism, it's focusing on the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Okay, so describes or Jeremy Bentham describes his greatest happiness principle in his introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, which is a 1789 publication in which he wrote that nature, okay, has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Okay, again, so based on what he have said in his publication, sabi ni Bentham, okay, we are being governed by two masters of our lives, pleasure and pain. Okay, so it is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. So nakadepende if an action produces pain or pleasure, whether you are going to do something or you're going to omit something. Of course, when we talk about pain and pleasure, if an action produces pleasure, then you have to do it. If an action produces pain, then you're not gonna do it. Okay, that's his principle. Okay, so again, promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number, at the same time weighing if an action, okay, produces pain or pleasure. Okay, so again, he advocated, okay, so he advocated that if the consequences, okay, of an action are good, then the act is moral, okay, and if the consequences are bad, then the act is immoral, okay. So he notes ethics at large may be defined as the art of directing men's actions to the production of the greatest possible quantity of happiness. That's ethics, according to Jeremy Bentham, okay? So if an action produces good and produces something that makes a person or makes everyone happy, then that's moral. That's a moral action. But if an action produces unhappiness towards the greater part of a society, okay, then that act is immoral, okay. So the moral agent will perform the action that maximizes happiness or pleasure for everyone involved, the greatest pleasure or the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Okay, so let's look at this summary of Bentham's Principle of Utilitarianism. Okay, so he recognized the fundamental role of pain and pleasure in human life. Okay, so if an action causes pleasure, then it's moral. If an action causes pain, then it's immoral. Okay, so he approves or disapproves of an action based on the amount of pain or pleasure brought about by that. For example, the consequences, okay? So he equates, of course, just like what I've told you a while ago, equates good with pleasure, evil with pain, okay? And by this, he was able to assert that pleasure and pain are capable of being quantified, hence being able to measured, which will then focus on this, okay? So sabi niya, the pain and pleasure daw can be quantified. Okay, so ibig sabihin they can be measured. All right, in order for us to gauge whether that action is really pleasurable or really causes pain. Okay, so he argued that in order for us to determine by this, we have to be very, very objective with regards to this, with the help of these. Okay, with the help of these parameters. Okay, so Bentham defended an objective form of morality that could be measured in a scientific way. So here is his kumbaga parang parameters in order to quantify and measure the pain or pleasure being done, okay, or the pain or pleasure of the action. Okay, so we have here the intensity. Okay, so Bentham apparently thought intensity would vary from 0 to infinity. Okay, but psychological data indicates an upper threshold of pleasure. Hence, we can use an ordinal relation from 0 to 10. Intensity. Let's say, for example, I'm sure you have heard about this, the pain scale. Okay, when you do the pain scale, all right, when you do the pain scale, it's like a pain scale, and the doctor will ask you, okay, on the scale of 0 to 10, how painful do you feel right now? Okay, so 0 being no pain and 10 being the highest level of pain. Okay, so that's how he quantified, okay, pain. All right, that's one way of quantifying pain. Okay, by describing the intensity. Now for the duration, okay, so we can use increments of time, let's say seconds, minutes, and so forth. Okay, the time interval from the perceived beginning of the pleasure until the end of the pleasure in question. Gaano kahaba? Okay, gaano kahaba na experience ang pain or pleasure? Okay. Certainties, the assigned probability can be drawn from records of our past experience and records from persons similar to us. Okay? Does it happen only to you, or does it also happen to other people? Is it an isolated case, or was it being experienced by other people as well? Okay? So the propinquity or the nearness or remoteness, okay, depends upon how long one must wait for the pleasure to occur. Okay, does this have a pattern? Okay, Do I have to wait several days or several years in order for me to experience this again? Okay. Now for the fecundity, okay, so the probability that the pleasure or pain will lead to other pleasure or pain of the same kind can be drawn from our records of our own past experience and the past experience of others like us. Thus, this action that produces pleasure will result in me experiencing other kinds of pleasure. Thus, this action that produces pain will result in me feeling other kinds of pain similar to this or related to this that I'm experiencing right now. Okay, that's fecundity. Okay, and for purity, okay, this Bentham writes that of the value of each pain which appears to be produced by it after the first, this constitutes the fecundity of the first pain and the impurity of the first pleasure. What is the probability that the pain will lead to other pains? Okay, and extent. Okay, lastly, the extent. This is the total amount of utility or pleasure can be had by summing a similar calculation for every other person who is affected by the action in question. Gaano kadaming tao ang naka-experience ng pleasure na to? Gaano kadaming tao ang naka-experience ng pain na ito? Alright, so that's how Jeremy Bentham was able to quantify and measure the quality of pain and pleasure. By that kasi, in order for us to truly judge an action if it's really right or wrong, we needed to apply these parameters, these measures in order for us to objectify. Okay, in order for us to objectify our claims whether an action will be considered right or wrong. Okay, again, for Jeremy Bentham, who follows utilitarianism, it should be an action should be producing good, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So we will judge a certain person's action based on if this action produced happiness to a lot of people, or does this action produce pain to a lot of people. So if it's causing pain for a lot of people, then that's an immoral action. If an action is producing a lot of happiness towards a lot of people, then that action is considered morally good. Okay? Now for John Stuart Mill, Mill defines utilitarianism as a theory based on the principle that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Because John Stuart Mill is actually a very big fan of Jeremy Bentham's theory on utilitarianism. That's why he supported John Stuart Mill supported Bentham's theory on utilitarianism, okay, providing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Mill defines happiness as pleasure and the absence of pain. Okay, same. Alright? He argues that pleasure can differ in quality and quantity. Okay, so there are different kinds of pleasure, and since there are different kinds of pleasure, we should focus on the better kinds of pleasure. Okay? And that pleasures that are rooted in one's higher faculties should be weighted more heavily than baser pleasures. Okay, so furthermore, Mill argues that people's achievement of goals and ends such as virtuous living should be counted as part of their happiness. What is John Stuart Mill trying to point out here, guys, is that for Jeremy Bentham kasi, there's only one common goal, and that's to achieve happiness. Okay, but for John Stuart Mill, he has different perceptions of happiness, and there are differences in the quality of happiness that you could get. Okay, there are different levels, there are different qualities. Okay, so qualitative differences in pleasure. So for example, intellectual pleasure could be construed as something which is much important than sensual or physiological pleasure. That's what the John Stuart Mill is trying to point out. Okay, he's not only referring to the general meaning of pleasure and happiness. He's also referring to the kind of happiness which has a higher value. Okay, so for John Stuart Mill, okay, intellectual pleasures has a higher value than physiological pleasures. Okay, so qualitative value of pleasure should be given more importance than the quantitative value. Yung sinasabing qualitative value of pleasure dito, ito yung mga kinds of pleasure that will enhance the deeper you, okay, your deeper character, your deeper personality. Okay, so it is the quality, not the quantity of pleasure that matters. So happy life is rich in higher pleasures, which is the higher kind of pleasure, which are better in quality than lower pleasures. Okay, higher pleasures yung mga intellectual pleasures, lower pleasures yung mga physiological pleasures. Okay, so higher pleasures are those of the mind. Sabi ko nga, yung mga nag-enrich ng iyong soul, ng iyong personality. Okay, pleasures of the intellect, of friendship, of art and beauty. Now, lower pleasures constitutes those that are physiological in nature, such as eating, such as the pleasure of drinking, sex, or napping on a sunny afternoon. Okay, so kung si Jeremy Bentham focuses on the general concept of achieving pleasure, okay, and happiness, si John Stuart Mill medyo choosy siya. Hindi lang siya dapat basta-basta happiness. It should be the higher kind of pleasure or happiness. Because for John Stuart Mill, there are different kinds of pleasures. Okay? Hindi daw pwedeng naka-generalize ang happiness natin. Masyadong vague, masyadong subjective. Okay? So let's try to be more specific when it comes to choosing the happiness. If we choose the higher kind of pleasures, then we become better people. We act morally. Okay, but if we focus on the lower kinds of pleasures, then it's not gonna be as morally good as the higher pleasures. Okay, so John Stuart Mill's theory focuses on us focusing on our higher pleasures. Okay, all right. So higher pleasures, those that enhance the mind, pleasures of the intellect, friendship, art, beauty. Lower pleasures, physiological pleasures. Okay, the pleasures of eating, drinking, sex, and napping on a sunny afternoon. Okay, so comparing and contrasting Bentham and Mill's theories, okay, so the commonality between the two of them is that these two theories are very much interested in whether these actions contribute or not to the total amount of resulting happiness in the world. At the end, the bottom line of studying Bentham and Mill is that the action, okay, that's the person doing the action, okay, does that action produces happiness for the greater good? That's the question. That's the first question that they wanted answered. Okay, and then that utilitarian value, pleasure, and happiness. This means that the usefulness of actions is based on its promotion of happiness. If an action doesn't promote happiness, then that is not good. That is immoral. If an action promotes happiness, then that is a moral action. If an action doesn't promote happiness, then that is an immoral action. All right? Okay. So, as a summary, okay, the summary of the things that we have discussed. Okay, so the two theories mentioned or argued that or noted that actions are to be judged right or wrong solely by virtue of their consequences. Does this produce happiness? Does this produce pain? Nothing else matters. In assessing consequences, the only thing that matters is the amount of happiness or unhappiness that is created. Everything else is irrelevant. Each person's happiness counts the same. Okay? That's why it's called the happiness for the greater happiness for the greater good. Alright? Alright. Okay, so alright, so that concludes my discussion on Module 16 of Gen 006 Ethics. Please stay tuned on my video discussion for Module 17, Ethical Challenges for Business, Globalization, and Business Ethics. Thank you guys, and see you!